finally, I want to get down to a subject that I find near and dear, and that is the concept of the creative differences. And creative differences are the ways we play, the ways we engage, and they vary from group to group and person to person. And I want to go over some of the variation between the idea of playing games for gifts or toys for gifts. And in this season, there's a great emphasis on toys, and I want to kind of give a sort of a justification or explanation for why you may want to consider including games in your collection of gifts for your loved ones, perhaps in advance or in a stronger way than advocating for toys. And the first one, I know that this list is going to be up there for the whole screen throughout the time, so I hope that doesn't distract. But the question of rules comes up all the time. If you are providing someone with a toy, then they have to take that toy and define how they're going to play with it. When you give them something that doesn't have a rule set, it doesn't have a guideline, and it has no limitations, it makes it difficult for a player to understand or comprehend how to use it. Now, classic examples are giving a toy truck or a toy car. Yes, it's got wheels. Yes, they know it rolls on the ground. But do you teach them about right of way? Do you teach them about the mechanics? These are all things that when you hand somebody a toy, you don't think about. You simply say, "Here's a ball. Here's a toy. Here's a doll. Here's a set of all of the different things you might give a child that are a toy, a replication of their actual life. Maybe you give them a set of mock surgery tools so they can play doctor. And I know that's going to get a lot of jokes, but the point here is that when you give someone a toy, there are no rules. And in early development, in the pre-speech development area of life, there is some merit to that because they don't comprehend it. The idea of chewing on a rubber car or a rubber, a child-safe chewable object, that's not really playing with a toy, perhaps. It's just giving them something to interact with. But when you get to the point where you're providing them with toys, you're not providing them with anything other than a mechanism. How will they use it? What rules are they going to apply to it? Now, for example, if you give somebody a toy, are they going to play nice with it and treat it with care and respect like they would an actual person? Or are they going to drop it down the stairs or thump its head against the wall? There's the idea of playing with toys is a dangerous proposition in some ways because you're not giving them any guidance. Whereas if you provide them with a game and you require them to learn the rules of the game in order to play it, you are teaching them not only the mechanism for that particular game, but you're teaching them the concept that we need to, for example, learn to take turns. We have to learn to wait for another person. We have to learn patience. In certain cases, you have to learn how to trade, how to compete. You're actually guiding them. The second thing about it is that when you give them a toy, are you affording them something that gives them player agency? Do they have permission to do with it whatever they want, or do you have some limitations and boundaries you want to set for it? In the case of a game, there are clearly outlined, defined rules for it that the players have to downplay their own will to be able to play the game, and therefore as they comprehend the rules, they can learn what those limits and boundaries are, and therefore become more accomplished at that game, and in the process learn how to play together. Now, there are those that would argue that it takes away liberties when you would rather, they would prefer to give them just something with no boundaries. But the challenge is that at a young age, children don't have the mechanism. And realize I'm speaking as an independent, not as an authority. I do not have an education in child rearing, but I have raised my own kids. And the idea of providing children, the games, you're giving them the ability to learn socialization, learn communication, learning patience, learning propriety, the very concept of following the rules, which is really integral to our ability to be a society and a community in the first place. The next is when it comes to providing children with a toy or a game, how much supervision is really required. If you provide children with a game, they will, if they follow the rules, if they've learned how to play by the rules, then the game itself is supervision enough, because it will determine who goes first, who goes second, and those kind of rules. And it also will establish who wins, who loses, and those kind of boundaries. Whereas if you provide them with let's say a ball, and you don't tell them how to, if there's not a rule book that comes with a ball. Now, granted, you can learn how to play games with balls, but that's a whole other issue. Next is how many players can be accommodated. Generally, toys are a singular activity. Yes, they can play cooperatively, they can be in the same place, but generally, especially early on, children aren't aware of even the concept of sharing or communicating through play, and so they have to learn that process. Games are a way to help that along by providing instruction on how to see who goes first, who goes next, who gets to speak, who has to wait. And these kind of mechanisms provide, again, a socializing, engaging mechanism as compared to the isolation of playing alone. If you were to observe two, for example, children playing with, I remember in particular the concept of I think it was G.I. Joe that had a martial hand. He had an effect that his hand could do. And so players would sit and talk about, oh, well, this is what my G.I. Joe would do. And the other kid's reaction is only to respond with, well, here's what my G.I. Joe would do. And there's no rules about which one's right, and therefore the players who are working with those individual objects are only trying to come up with their own solutions. They're not actually able to look at the rule and say, no, this is what it does. Whereas if you were playing a game, the rules would describe which would be proper, which ones apply and which ones don't. Now, this is important because play in many cases is intended to be a shared experience. When we were younger, I would say, if I took out my teeth, back in my day, we used to have to go outside and play with our friends because we didn't be on the TV that long. Oh, that's my bad example of my grandfather's voice. But the idea is that a shared experience can occur when players are of the same mind, and a game definitely gives both participants or multiple participants the same experience game after game, because they have the rules to fall back on to define what the experience should be. How do you score it? How do you keep track? How do you determine what the priority is? And other mechanical things that make sense in a game that also will help us to understand how things work in real life as well. Because of these things, the very concept of communication in play becomes a factor. When we learn to play by rules, we can convey information between us because we have a shared vocabulary in terms of the game. So we understand your turn, my turn, understand the words like round or turn or sequence. We have a shared vocabulary, and that makes the play experience more collaborative because we are both working with the same words. Whereas in the case of two players bringing a toy to the table, they may not even have similar vocabularies, and there's no determining which ones are correct or which ones are useful or right. And we have a difficulty when we can't communicate, when we can't transfer meaning, and when we have a shared vocabulary because of games, whether it be checkers or chess or role-play games. When we have a vocabulary that is shared between us, we can exchange information and know that the meaning that we intended is transferred, and therefore makes the communication process so much more effective. So when we talk about that, we get down to what toys are useful for. In many cases, toys are useful for the concept of role play. Parents provide their children with items that might be replicative of what their parents use. For example, a businessman might give his child a toy briefcase with the pens and papers and folders and all the kind of things that the father would use or the mother would use. And perhaps, as I mentioned before, the concept of a doctor's set, a physician's set, or a police officer's gear, or whatever. When you provide them with items to role play those experiences, if they're a toy, there's no mechanism, there's no understanding, and they'll only replicate what they see. And sometimes this can be good, and sometimes this can be horribly bad if they're observing things that are detrimental in culture. So the idea, therefore, of having a game mechanism that explains what you're doing, for example, the game operation is a prime subject. The idea of teaching children to play being a surgeon is showing hand-eye coordination and the ability to be patient and still and all of that. These are all things that allow the game operation to emulate, or in some way sort of pretend to be, the surgeon, and therefore develop the kinds of hand-eye skills. And if you were particularly good at that game, you might be induced to consider a career at that kind of thing. And while it's not always the case, the idea of a game mechanism allows you to follow the parameters and the rules for such things. Now, the very concept of role play and the more sophisticated nature of role-playing games that are generally played by high school or older kids isn't always so directly relatable, but it does increase their ability to communicate because it does give them a shared vocabulary and a uniform structure of conversation. Now, the next is the concept of identity and independence, and some people would argue toys are far better at this because you, as a independent player, can devise your own rules. But that's not necessarily the case. Perhaps you will be more capricious with your items because there are no boundaries and there are no rules. In today's age, perhaps you'll pull up the kind of ball or the kind of objects you have and look for rules online. But that's supplanting the very message I'm trying to give here, and that is that, yes, a role-playing game or a board game does seem, at least at the beginning, to take away your independence. But if you are looking at the higher quality games, such as the ones listed in my list of games you need to own, perhaps if you are looking at a game that gives you multiple ways to win, multiple strategies, then you're allowed to build your own independence on your way of playing through that game. And that individuality can even spill over when you're talking about the deeper, richer role-playing games and such, because then you are building your personality into the persona or character of the game. The biggest challenge is that, therefore, when you are playing, you are acknowledging the shared experience and you're acknowledging the propriety of your actions versus other people's actions, and understanding things like timing and sequencing and things like that you can't learn in playing with your toys. And the next one is the law of rules and the rule of law. When I say the law of rules, when you talk about an item and you're going to provide it to a child, if you don't provide them with boundaries and limitations, you are obligating yourself to be responsible for how that person plays. If you give a child a doll and you don't say, treat it with care, this is like a child, da da da, you are asking for them to mistreat it, and then you'll have to undo their misunderstanding of it because they didn't comprehend it in the way you intended it. So a game, on the other hand, provides a set rules and boundaries and limits for action. And while, yes, you do have to teach either or both, the concept of what rule system you're going to use is far different and far more independent of the person who's giving the gift than if it was a toy. You're actually able to provide them with a game that gives them the mechanisms for the education you wish to provide. Finally, on that part, if you learn to play games, you're learning how to play by the rules, and our culture is built on the rule of law. So it makes sense if you play a lot of games as a child, you learn how to play within the rules and therefore how to play within the boundaries of our culture and become part of the community as a whole. Now, this leads, of course, to the ultimate form of gameplay, and that is the understanding that you actually can form rules. And so the idea of creativity stems, therefore, into the area of gameplay by allowing the players to understand there is agency and they can make rules that apply only to the games they play at home. And this is where the idea of house rules comes from, that the games that you play, yes, they have a set parameter for overall play, but you also have the opportunity to pick a specific set of boundaries that you wish to impose on the game for your own enjoyment and to make the game flow better, perhaps within your game playing community. So just realize that the process leads to people who create rules, which means they create games, and when they create games, they're providing new opportunities for others to play, and so on. And so when I argue that games are a better choice for gifts, all I'm trying to point out is that you are creating a more social community when you provide them with a way to communicate, a vocabulary to use, and a mechanism by which to bring other people into their world. Alrighty, so that is the end of the things I wanted to commit to tonight. I want to thank you if you've been watching this episode. I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master J. If you want more information on the NycosRPG, please check out our website at NycosRPG.com for product information and purchases. You also want to look at NycosRPG.info for the story lore on the campaigns that are run within the NycosRPG game system. You can also join us on our Discord, which is listed below here on the Discord and the Twitch channel, or you can find out more information at NycosRPG on YouTube. I want to thank you again for being here tonight, and if you've enjoyed what you've seen, please follow our channel and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you'll get updated whenever we do new videos. And if you want to become part of our community, don't forget to check out patreon.com/join/Nykos. I want to thank you again for your participation tonight, and have a great night.